The first thing anyone noticed about the Thornvale estate wasn't its size or its position overlooking Black Hollow Ridge like a stone sentinel. It was the silence. Even in a frontier town where hard winters killed conversations and brutal work left people too tired for pleasantries, the Thornvale house stood apart. It didn't hum with life the way other ranches did. There were no dogs barking in the yard, no ranch hands laughing near the stables, no kitchen sounds drifting through open windows. Just silence, thick and deliberate, like someone had taken all the noise in the world and buried it beneath frozen ground. Evelyn Mercer, or Evelyne Thornvale, though she rarely thought of herself that way anymore, had lived inside that silence for 8 years. She'd arrived as a bride at 19, hopeful in the way young women were when they believed love could be built from good intentions and shared meals. She'd left her family's modest homestead 30 miles south, carrying nothing but a worn trunk and the promise that Garrick Thornvale, the most powerful ranch lord in 3 territories, had chosen her. The townsfolk had whispered even then, why her? She wasn't the prettiest girl in the valley, wasn't from money, wasn't connected to the railroad men or the territory officials. She was just Evelyn, the middle daughter of a wheat farmer, quiet and practical, with steady hands and a sharp mind for numbers. Garrick had seen her once at a church social, spoken to her twice, and proposed a week later through her father. She'd said yes because women like her didn't get many choices, and because Garrick Thornvale, for all his cold reputation, had looked at her during that second conversation like she mattered. That look hadn't lasted. Now, standing in the kitchen of the main house on a January morning so cold the windows had frosted over completely, Evelyne moved through her routine with the precision of someone who had stopped expecting anything to change. She prepared breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness, strong coffee, cornbread, salt pork, and set Garrick's portion on the dining table in the front room. She ate her own meal standing at the kitchen counter alone, because that was how things worked in this house. Separate rooms, separate lives, separate everything except the name they shared and the ledgers she kept for the ranch operations he never discussed with her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Halloway, arrived as the sun barely touched the horizon, her face pinched against the wind. "Morning, ma'am," she said, unwinding her shawl. She never called Evelyne by her first name. None of the staff did. It wasn't disrespect exactly, more like they weren't sure what to call a woman who ran a household but didn't seem to live in it. "Morning, the fire's going in the main room. I'll need the guest quarters prepared today." Mrs. Halloway's eyebrows lifted. "Guest quarters? We expecting someone?" "Mr. Thornvale's brother is returning." The words dropped into the kitchen like stones into still water. Mrs. Halloway's expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something that might have been pity. Ryland's coming back? After all this time? Apparently. Evelyn didn't elaborate because Garrick hadn't elaborated when he'd mentioned it the previous evening. He'd been standing in the doorway of his study, their paths crossed maybe twice a day, usually in doorways, and he'd said, "My brother arrives Thursday. See that the West Wing is ready," before disappearing back into the room where he spent most of his time. No explanation. No discussion of why Ryland had been gone for 6 years, or why he was returning now, or what it meant. Evelyne had learned not to ask questions. Questions required conversations, and conversations required 2 people willing to engage in them. "Well," Mrs. Halloway said carefully, "that'll certainly shake things up." That was an understatement. Ryland Thornvale was everything his older brother wasn't. Loud where Garrick was silent, reckless where Garrick was controlled, warm where Garrick was ice. The 2 brothers had clashed for years before Ryland finally left, and the whole town had watched it happen. Some said Ryland ran off to escape his brother's shadow. Others claimed Garrick drove him out. Evelyne had only met Ryland once, briefly, during her engagement, and he'd looked at her with something like sympathy even then. "You sure about this?" he'd asked her quietly, when Garrick stepped away. She hadn't understood the question at the time. She did now. The day Ryland was set to arrive, Evelyne spent the morning in the West Wing guest room, checking details Mrs. Halloway had already handled. Fresh linens, clean windows, firewood stacked. It was pointless work, the kind she did when she needed her hands busy to keep her mind from wandering into dangerous territory. Thinking too much in this house was a mistake. Thinking led to feeling, and feeling led to the kind of pain she'd learned to lock away in the same cold silence that filled every room. She was smoothing an already smooth bedspread when she heard the commotion outside. Hoofbeats, voices, the kind of noise that didn't happen here. She moved to the window and looked down at the front drive. Ryland Thornvale swung down from his horse like a man who'd never learned to move carefully. He was broader than she remembered, rougher, with a thick beard and trail dust covering clothes that had seen hard travel. He said something to the stable hand that made the kid laugh. Actually, laugh, a sound so foreign to the Thornvale estate it might as well have been birdsong in December. Then Garrick appeared on the front steps. The brothers stood facing each other in the winter sunlight, and even from the second-floor window, Evelyne could feel the tension. They didn't embrace, didn't shake hands, just stood there, two men carved from the same unforgiving stone, staring each other down like rival predators meeting at a territorial boundary. "Garrick," Ryland said, his voice carried. "Ryland, hell of a welcome. You expected warmth? From me?" Ryland actually smiled at that, sharp and humorless. "No, that'd require you to feel something." Garrick's jaw tightened, but he turned without responding and walked back into the house. Ryland watched him go, shook his head, and followed. Evelyne stepped back from the window. Her heart was beating faster than it should, and she didn't know why. This wasn't her conflict. These weren't her emotions to navigate. She was just the woman who lived here, the wife in name only, the housekeeper with a wedding ring. She stayed in the West Wing until dinner, organizing things that didn't need organizing, avoiding the inevitable moment when she'd have to sit at the same table as both brothers and pretend this was normal. Pretend any of this was normal. When she finally came downstairs, she found them in the dining room. Garrick sat at the head of the table, exactly where he always sat, reading through ranch reports with the focused intensity he brought to everything except his marriage. Ryland sprawled in a chair to his right, boots propped on an empty seat, looking around the room like he was cataloging changes. "Still as cheerful as a funeral," Ryland said to no one in particular. Garrick didn't look up. "If you wanted cheerful, you shouldn't have come back." "Didn't say I wanted it, just noting the atmosphere." Ryland's eyes landed on Evelyne as she entered. He sat up straighter, swung his boots off the chair. "Ma'am." The courtesy surprised her. Garrick still hadn't looked up. "Mr. Thornvale," she said quietly. "Ryland, please. Mr. Thornvale makes me feel like my father, and that's a hell I'd rather avoid." The corner of her mouth almost twitched. Almost. "Ryland, then." She took her usual seat, 3 chairs down from Garrick, the distance carefully maintained, and nodded to Mrs. Halloway to begin serving. The meal appeared in stages: roasted venison, potatoes, winter greens preserved in the cold cellar, bread. Good food, prepared well, eaten in suffocating silence, or it would have been if Ryland had followed the house rules. "So," he said, cutting into his venison with more force than necessary, "anyone going to tell me what I missed? 6 years is a long time. Town looks the same. House looks the same." His eyes flicked between them. "You two look—" "The ranch is profitable," Garrick interrupted, still not looking up from the papers he'd brought to the table. "Cattle numbers are strong. We survived the drought better than most. The new grazing contracts with the railroad should—" "I didn't ask about the damn cattle, Garrick." Silence dropped like a cleaver. Garrick finally looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes hard. "Then what did you ask?" "I asked how you've been. You and your wife. Basic human conversation. You remember those?" Evelyne's fingers tightened on her fork. She kept her eyes on her plate, a survival instinct honed over 8 years. Don't engage. Don't react. Don't give anyone a reason to look closer at the cracks. "We're well," Garrick said flatly. "Anything else?" Ryland stared at his brother for a long moment, then turned to Evelyne. His expression had shifted into something gentler, more careful. "Ma'am, Evelyne, you keeping well? This house treating you right?" It was a simple question, a kind question. The kind someone might ask at any dinner table in any home across the frontier. But here, in this room, with this history, it felt like someone had thrown open a window in the middle of winter and let the storm inside. "I'm well, thank you," she said quietly. "You sure about that?" "Ryland," Garrick's voice carried a warning. "Just asking, just seems like— Don't." The word cut across the table with the force of a gunshot. Garrick was looking at his brother now, really looking, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Evelyne had seen that look before, usually directed at ranch hands who'd screwed up badly or rival ranchers trying to muscle in on Thornvale territory. She'd never seen it aimed at family. Ryland held his ground. Don't what? Don't notice that your wife looks like she's living in a prison? Don't ask basic questions? Don't act like a human being? Don't interfere in things you don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand I left a newlywed couple and came back to two strangers eating dinner in the same room. I understand this house feels like a tomb. I understand Garrick stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You understand nothing. You left. You chose to leave. So don't come back here and pass judgment on choices you know nothing about. He walked out without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until a door slammed somewhere deep in the house. Evelyne sat very still, her dinner half-eaten, her hands folded in her lap. She'd learned long ago how to disappear while still sitting in plain sight. Ryland let out a long breath. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make things worse. You didn't make anything worse. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. This is just how things are. How things are? Evelyne, please don't. She looked at him finally, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop. I appreciate your concern, but this is my life, my marriage, and I've learned to live with it. That's not living. It's surviving. In a place like this, that's enough. She excused herself before he could argue, retreating to the kitchen where Mrs. Halloway was already cleaning up. The housekeeper took one look at her face and wordlessly poured her a cup of tea. Evelyne accepted it, wrapping her hands around the warmth, and stood at the window overlooking the dark expanse of ranch land beyond. 8 years. 8 years of this. She'd been 19 when she married Garrick Thornvale, full of quiet hope and practical expectations. She hadn't expected passion. Frontier marriages weren't built on romance. They were built on partnership, shared work, mutual survival. She'd expected respect, companionship, maybe eventually something like affection. Instead, she'd gotten silence. It started on their wedding night when Garrick had been dutiful but distant, performing an obligation rather than sharing intimacy. She'd told herself it was nerves, that they'd grow closer with time. But time brought only more distance. Separate bedrooms within a month. Separate routines within 6. By the end of the first year, they barely spoke except about household necessities. The town noticed. How could they not? At social gatherings, Garrick arrived alone, or left her standing on the edges while he discussed business with other men. At church, they sat together, but might as well have been strangers. And when the years passed without children, without even the possibility of children, given how thoroughly Garrick avoided her, the whispers started. She's barren. He regrets marrying her. Should have chosen the Harrison girl instead. Poor thing. Pretty enough, but clearly something wrong with her. Evelyne heard the whispers because people in small towns never whispered quietly enough. She felt them like cuts, small and constant, bleeding her dry one judgment at a time. And Garrick never defended her, never corrected the assumptions, never stood beside her and told them the truth. That there were no children because there was no marriage. Not really, just two people sharing a name and an address and nothing else. She'd asked him once, 2 years in, why he married her if he wanted nothing to do with her. He'd looked at her with those cold gray eyes and said, I needed a wife. You needed security. That's all this has to be. She hadn't asked again. Mrs. Halloway touched her shoulder gently. You should rest, ma'am. It's been a long day. Evelyne nodded and headed upstairs to her room. Her room, not their room, because they'd stopped pretending about that years ago. It was a comfortable space, well appointed, with good light and a fireplace that kept the winter cold at bay. A beautiful cage. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, and climbed into bed with a book she'd been trying to finish for weeks. But the words blurred on the page, her mind wandering to the confrontation at dinner, to Ryland's question. You sure about that? No. She wasn't sure. She hadn't been sure about anything in years. Sleep came eventually, fitful and thin, full of half-formed dreams about locked doors and frozen rivers and voices calling from distances she couldn't cross. The next few days fell into a strange new rhythm. Garrick doubled down on his absence, leaving early for the far pastures and returning late, eating cold dinners in his study. Ryland, by contrast, seemed determined to fill every silence with noise. He talked to the ranch hands, fixed broken equipment, rode the property lines, and showed up in the kitchen asking Mrs. Halloway questions that made her laugh. And he talked to Evelyne, not in intrusive ways, not pushing past boundaries, just talking about the weather, the ranch operations, his travels over the past 6 years, Montana, Wyoming, even down into Colorado territory. He'd worked cattle drives, tried his hand at mining, spent a winter as a deputy sheriff in a town so small it didn't have a name. Why come back? Evelyne asked one afternoon. She'd been checking supply inventories in the storage barn, and he'd wandered in, ostensibly to find an extra saddle blanket. He shrugged. Ran out of reasons to stay gone, I guess. Figured it was time to face the music. What music is that? The one where I try to figure out if my brother's still human or if he's gone completely cold. Evelyne didn't answer that. Couldn't. Ryland studied her for a moment. You ever think about leaving? The question landed like a physical blow. She looked up sharply. Why would you ask that? Because I'm watching you disappear right in front of me, and I don't think you even notice anymore. I'm fine. You keep saying that, but I don't think you know what fine is supposed to look like. She turned back to her inventory list, her hands shaking slightly. This is my home, my marriage. I made vows. Vows go both ways, Evelyne. Don't. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Don't stand there and tell me about my marriage when you don't know anything about it. You left. You got out. Some of us don't have that option. He was quiet for a long time. Then, you could, though, if you wanted to. There are places. Stop, please. She looked at him finally, and whatever he saw made him back off. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't need saving. I just need this to be what it is. That night, the first real blizzard of the season hit. The wind came screaming down from the mountains, bringing snow so thick it turned midday into twilight. The temperature dropped fast and brutal, the kind of cold that found every gap in every wall and reminded frontier settlers exactly how small they were against the land. Evelyne spent the evening checking windows, making sure fires were banked properly, preparing extra bedding in case the storm lasted days. It was practical work, familiar work, the kind that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. She was in the hallway upstairs, carrying blankets to the guest rooms, when she heard voices from Garrick's study below. The door must have been partially open because the words carried clearly. You can't keep doing this, Ryland's voice frustrated. Doing what? Garrick sounded tired. Treating her like furniture, ignoring her, pretending she doesn't exist. My marriage is none of your concern. The hell it isn't. I'm watching you destroy a good woman through sheer neglect, and you won't even admit there's a problem. There is no problem. We have an arrangement. It works. For who? Works for you? Because from where I'm standing, it's killing her. You've been here 4 days. Don't presume to know. 4 days is enough to see what 8 years did. She's a ghost, Garrick. You turned your wife into a ghost. A long pause. Then Garrick's voice dangerously quiet. You think you understand. You think because you rode back here playing the prodigal son, you can fix everything with charm and conversation, but you don't know anything about what I... He stopped. Leave it alone. Why? Why did you even marry her if you were going to treat her like this? Because I thought I could... Another pause, longer this time. It doesn't matter what I thought. This is how things are. That's not good enough. It's going to have to be. Evelyne stood frozen in the hallway, blankets clutched to her chest, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd never heard Garrick talk about their marriage before, never heard him acknowledge it as anything other than a transaction. The rawness in his voice, the almost confession before he shut it down. It opened something in her chest that she'd kept locked for years. She forced herself to move, to continue down the hallway to the guest rooms, to finish her tasks. But the conversation echoed in her head all night. I thought I could what? Love her? Let himself be vulnerable? Build something real? Why had he stopped? The storm raged for 3 days. The world outside became nothing but white noise and brutal cold. Inside the estate, the tension ratcheted higher. Garrick stayed locked in his study. Ryland paced like a caged animal. And Evelyne maintained her routines with mechanical precision, because routines were all she had. On the third night, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She fell into bed bone-tired, the kind of tired that should have meant immediate sleep. Instead, her mind raced. Thoughts she'd been suppressing for years bubbled up like water through cracked ice. She was 27 years old, still young, still capable of having a different life. Ryland was right. She could leave. She had skills. She could keep books for a business, manage a household, teach children. She wasn't trapped by lack of options. She was trapped by vows she'd made and a stubborn, foolish hope that someday Garrick would look at her the way he had during that second conversation before their engagement, like she mattered. 8 years later, she was still waiting. The grief of it hit her all at once, a wave so powerful it dragged her under. She buried her face in her pillow and cried, really cried, for the first time in years. Not quiet tears, not dignified sadness, gut-wrenching sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping. And somewhere in the middle of it, exhausted beyond measure, she fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. She didn't know she was dreaming at first. The boundary between sleep and waking had dissolved. She was in the house, but it was different. Doors that were always locked stood open. Hallways that were always empty filled with voices. She was searching for something, someone, running from room to room with increasing desperation. Then she was in Garrick's study, and he was there, but younger, softer, the way he'd looked during their brief courtship. He reached for her hand. "Stay," he said. "I am staying," she told him. "I've always stayed." "No, you're disappearing. Don't disappear." She tried to answer, but the dream shifted, fracturing. She was alone again, in a house growing colder, walls closing in. She was calling out, but no sound came. She was trapped, and this time there was no way out. "Garrick," she cried, or tried to cry. "Garrick, please." Ooh. The name tore out of her desperate and broken, and somewhere in the real world, outside the dream, her sleeping voice carried it into the storm-dark hallway. Garrick heard it. He was in his study, had been for hours, staring at ledgers without seeing them. The storm howled against the windows. The house creaked and settled. And then, cutting through it all, he heard his name spoken in a voice he barely recognized as his wife's, raw, desperate, pleading. He was out of his chair before conscious thought caught up, moving down the hallway, climbing the stairs, standing outside her door with his hand on the wood, frozen. He hadn't crossed this threshold in 8 years. He told himself it was respect, distance, protection. But hearing her call his name like that, like he was the only thing between her and complete darkness, shattered every excuse he'd built. He opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by the dying fire. Evelyne was asleep, but not peacefully. She twisted in the sheets, her face tight with distress, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Garrick," she said again, quieter now, broken. "Please don't leave me alone, please." Something in his chest cracked wide open. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. Up close, he could see everything he'd been avoiding for years. The exhaustion carved into her features, the weight she'd lost, the way even in sleep she looked like she was bracing for pain. He'd done this. Not through cruelty or hatred, but through cowardice. Through fear of the one thing the frontier had never taught him how to handle, loving someone so much the thought of losing them was unbearable. So he'd pushed her away first, before the land could take her, before illness or childbirth or any of the 1,000 ways the frontier killed women could steal her from him. He'd created distance to protect himself from grief, and in doing so, he'd created the very loss he feared. "Evelyne," he touched her shoulder carefully, ready to pull back if she woke frightened. "Evelyne, wake up." Her eyes opened slowly, confused and heavy with sleep. She stared at him for a long moment, like she wasn't sure he was real. "Garrick?" "I'm here." She sat up slowly, pulling the blankets around herself, her expression shifting from confusion to wariness. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" "You were dreaming. You called out." Embarrassment flooded her face. She looked away. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." "Don't apologize." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Don't ever apologize for that." Silence stretched between them, thick with 8 years of things unsaid. The storm rattled the windows. The fire popped softly in the hearth. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, her voice very small. He should leave. Stand up, make some excuse, retreat back to the safety of separation. That was what he'd done for 8 years. But he'd heard her calling his name like it was the only word she knew, and he couldn't do it anymore. "Because I've been a coward," he said. She looked at him sharply, surprise breaking through her careful composure. I married you because I wanted... He stopped, forced himself to continue. Because I wanted something I'd never had. Someone to build something with. Someone who saw me as more than the Thornvale name and the ranch and the reputation. You looked at me like I was just a man, and that terrified me. So you ignored me for 8 years? The hurt in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. I thought if I kept distance between us, if I didn't let myself... He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into his words. The frontier takes everything, Evelyne. It takes crops and cattle and money and people. I've lost neighbors to disease, ranch hands to accidents, friends to stupidity and bad luck. And I thought if I didn't love you, if I kept you at arm's length, it wouldn't destroy me when this place took you too. So you destroyed us instead. Yes. The admission hurt. Yes, I did. She was crying again, silently, tears sliding down her face in the firelight. Do you have any idea what these years have been like? Being married to someone who can barely stand to be in the same room, having the whole town whisper about what's wrong with me, watching you look right through me like I'm not even there? I know. You don't. You can't. Because you were protecting yourself, and I was just surviving, day after day, year after year, trying to figure out what I did wrong, why I wasn't enough, why you couldn't even... Her voice broke. Garrick reached for her hand before he could stop himself. She flinched but didn't pull away. There is nothing wrong with you, he said fiercely. Nothing. You've been... The words stuck in his throat, years of silence making them difficult to form. You've been the only good thing in this house, and I was too afraid to admit it. Afraid of what? Of losing you. Of caring so much that losing you would break me. Of being the kind of man who could be broken. She stared at him, anger and hurt and something else warring in her expression. So instead, you broke me. The truth of it hit like a physical blow. Yes, that's not protection, Garrick. That's cruelty. I know. And now what? You come in here, tell me you were afraid and everything's supposed to be fine? 8 years of loneliness erased because you finally decided to be honest? No. He kept his hand on hers, gentle but steady. No, I know it doesn't work that way, but I'm asking for a chance to try, to do better, to be what I should have been from the beginning. Why now? Why not 3 years ago, 5 years ago? Why wait until Ryland came back and called you out? He could lie, make it sound noble, but she deserved the truth, ugly as it was. Because I heard you calling my name in your sleep, and it sounded like you were dying. And I realized I'd rather face losing you while trying to love you than lose you because I was too much of a coward to try at all. The words hung between them, raw and imperfect. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 8 years of silence pressed against them from all sides. Evelyne pulled her hand away slowly. I don't know if I believe you. I don't blame you. I don't know if I can forgive this. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can change. She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. He saw the girl she'd been at 19, hopeful and practical. And he saw the woman she'd become at 27, worn down but not broken, still standing despite everything he'd put her through. One chance, she said finally. That's all. You don't get to break me again. I won't. I mean it, Garrick. I've spent 8 years in this house feeling like I'm not enough. Like I'm invisible. If you're going to do this, really do this, I need to matter, not as a wife in name only, not as someone managing your household, as a person you actually see. I see you, Ta. His voice came out rough. I've always seen you. That was the problem. She didn't respond to that, just pulled the blankets tighter around herself and looked toward the window where snow beat against the glass in white sheets. It's late, she said quietly. The storm's getting worse. It was a dismissal, gentle but firm. She needed space, and he had no right to ask for more. He stood slowly, every instinct screaming at him to stay, to keep talking, to fix 8 years of damage in one conversation. But he'd done enough pushing for one night. At the door, he paused. Evelyne? Yes? Thank you. For giving me a chance I don't deserve. She didn't answer, and he didn't wait for one. He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and stood in the hallway as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. 8 years of distance. 8 years of hurting the one person he'd actually wanted to protect. And now, finally, a fragile chance to build something real. If he didn't destroy it first. In her room, Evelyne sat awake long after his footsteps faded. Her hands shook, her heart raced. And for the first time in 8 years, she felt something other than resignation. Hope, maybe? Or terror? Possibly both. She'd survived this long by accepting what was, by making peace with a loveless marriage and a silent house, and a life measured in small, careful routines. But Garrick had just thrown open a door she thought was permanently locked, and she had no idea what waited on the other side, whether it was the partnership she'd once dreamed of or just another way for him to hurt her. The storm raged outside. The house creaked and settled, and Evelyne sat in the darkness, trying to decide if one chance was worth the risk of breaking all over again. Morning came gray and unforgiving. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of snow and a silence that felt different from the usual Thornvale quiet. This silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Evelyne woke with her body aching from too little sleep and too much emotion. For a moment, lying in bed with pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows, she wondered if the previous night had been another dream. But her eyes were swollen from crying, and her chest still felt raw, like someone had reached in and rearranged everything she'd carefully organized to survive. She dressed slowly, her hands unsteady on the buttons of her gray wool dress. The mirror showed a woman who looked older than 27, worn at the edges in ways that had nothing to do with the frontier cold. She pinned her hair up with more care than usual, a small act of defiance against the exhaustion threatening to pull her under. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Halloway already in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she worked dough for bread. "Morning, ma'am." Storm finally quit. "Mr. Garrick's already out checking on the livestock with the hands. Ryland went with him." Evelyne nodded, relief and disappointment tangling together. She wasn't ready to face Garrick yet, but his absence felt like retreat, and she'd had enough of him retreating. "Coffee's hot," Mrs. Halloway added, softer. "You look like you could use it." "That obvious? You've got the look of someone who spent the night wrestling with something heavy." The older woman's eyes were kind but knowing. "Not my business, but if you need an ear, I appreciate that. I'm fine." Mrs. Halloway gave her a look that said she didn't believe that for a second, but she didn't push. Instead, she handed Evelyne a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint and went back to her bread. Evelyne took the coffee to the front room, settling in the chair by the window that overlooked the main drive. The snow had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks buried, the world reduced to white hills and dark tree lines. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure, like most things on the frontier. She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard the men returning, voices carrying across the snow-muffled yard. Through the window, she watched Garrick and Ryland approach the house, their breath steaming in the cold air. They weren't arguing, which was notable, but they weren't exactly companionable either, more like two people observing a temporary truce. She stood before this came inside, unwilling to be caught sitting idle. She'd learned early in her marriage that being useful was the only acceptable state of existence in this house. The front door opened on a gust of cold air. Both men stamped snow off their boots in the entryway. "Lost 2 head in the north pasture," Garrick was saying. "Found them too late. The rest are holding, but we need to get feet out there today before—" He stopped when he saw Evelyne standing in the doorway. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Ryland's eyes moved between them, reading the shift in the air. "Morning," Garrick said, his voice careful in a way it hadn't been yesterday. "Morning," Evelyne replied. Ryland cleared his throat. Mrs. Halloway mentioned something about breakfast. I'll go see about that." He disappeared toward the kitchen with the kind of obvious discretion that would have been funny under different circumstances. Evelyne and Garrick stood in the front room, the space between them charged with everything that had been said in the dark hours of the storm. "How are you?" Garrick asked. "Tired?" I know what you meant." She crossed her arms, not quite defensive, but not open either. "I'm not sure how to answer it." He nodded slowly, accepting that. "The livestock took a hit from the storm. I need to ride out with the hands to assess damage and get supplies to the far pastures. I'll be gone most of the day." "All right, He hesitated, like there was more he wanted to say, but whatever it was got stuck somewhere between intention and speech. Instead, he just nodded again and headed toward his study to gather equipment. Evelyne released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She'd spent 8 years learning to read Garrick's silences, and this one was different, uncertain, almost vulnerable. It unsettled her more than his usual cold distance ever had, because distance she understood. This, whatever this new thing was, required navigation skills she'd never developed. Breakfast was a strange affair. Ryland tried to maintain conversation, asking about the ranch operations and the town and anything that didn't require addressing the obvious tension. Garrick answered in short sentences, his attention divided between his food and the window, like he was planning escape routes. Evelyne ate mechanically, aware of both men watching her when they thought she wasn't looking. When Garrick finally left with the ranch hands, the house seemed to exhale. Ryland poured himself another coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, studying Evelyne with the directness that seemed to be his default setting. "So," he said, "something happened." "I don't know what you mean." "You're a terrible liar." And Garrick looked like a man who'd been hit by something he didn't see coming. "What happened after I went to bed?" Evelyne considered deflecting. But she was tired of performing, tired of pretending everything was fine when nothing had been fine for 8 years. And Ryland, for all his faults, at least seemed to care about the truth. "He came to my room last night, during the storm." Ryland's eyebrows rose. "He what?" "I was having a nightmare. I must have called out. He heard me and came in." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "We talked. Really talked. For the first time since, maybe the first time ever. About? About why he's been the way he's been. About what this marriage has cost both of us. About whether there's any way to fix 8 years of damage." Ryland let out a low whistle. That's something. What did he say? What reason could he possibly have for treating you like... He was afraid. The words came out flat. He was afraid of loving me because the frontier takes everything, and he thought keeping distance would protect him from losing me. That's the stupidest... Ryland stopped, visibly controlling his temper. "I'm sorry. I know he's my brother, but that's the stupidest reasoning I've ever heard. You don't protect yourself from loss by creating it." I said something similar. "What are you going to do?" Evelyne looked down at her coffee. "I told him he had one chance, to do better, to actually try." "And you believe he will? Actually try?" "I don't know." The admission hurt. "I want to, but wanting something and believing it are different things." Ryland was quiet for a moment, then, "For what it's worth, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you this morning, like he was afraid you'd disappear if he looked away too long." "That's just guilt." "Maybe. Or maybe he finally realized what he's been throwing away." Before Evelyne could respond, Mrs. Halloway bustled in with news that the supply cellar needed inventory and several preserves jars had cracked in the cold. Evelyne seized the excuse to escape the conversation, spending the rest of the morning in practical work that required her hands but not her heart. By afternoon, cabin fever drove her outside despite the cold. She bundled in her heaviest coat and wool scarf and picked her way through the snow-covered yard to the barn. The building was warm with animal heat and hay-sweet air. A few ranch hands nodded to her as they worked, and she nodded back, grateful they didn't try to make conversation. She found herself in the tack room, ostensibly checking supplies, but really just needing space to breathe. The room smelled like leather and saddle soap and honest work, and she stood there letting the familiar scents ground her. "You hiding?" She turned to find Ryland in the doorway, hay stuck to his coat. "No, checking inventory." "Right, and I'm out here because I love shoveling snow." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You want to talk about it?" "There's nothing to talk about." "Evelyne, I'm not trying to pry, but I watched you for years. Before I left, I saw what this marriage was doing to you, and now something's shifted, and I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm not okay," she said, the honesty surprising her. "I haven't been okay in a long time, but I'm trying to figure out if there's a path from not okay to something better, or if I'm just setting myself up to get hurt worse." "What does your gut tell you?" "My gut tells me I'm an idiot for giving him another chance. My gut also tells me I'll regret it forever if I don't." She laughed, the sound bitter. So my gut is useless. Ryland leaned against the workbench. He's my brother, so I'm biased. But I will say this. Garrick's a lot of things. Stubborn, proud, emotionally constipated as hell. But he's not a liar. If he told you he wants to try, he means it. Wanting and doing are different things. True, but you don't know which one it'll be until you let him try. She wanted to argue, but he was right. She'd spent 8 years knowing exactly what to expect. Silence, distance, loneliness. Now she was facing uncertainty, and uncertainty was terrifying in ways the known misery had never been. I should get back to the house, she said. Mrs. Halloway will need help with dinner. Ryland moved aside to let her pass, but caught her arm gently as she reached the door. Hey, whatever happens, whatever you decide, you deserve better than what you've had. Don't forget that. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She nodded quickly and escaped before the tears could start again. Garrick returned as the sun was setting, bringing with him a blast of cold air and exhaustion written across every line of his body. 2 more cattle lost, fences down in 3 sections, and one of the line shacks had partially collapsed under the snow weight. Minor disasters in the scheme of frontier ranching, but disasters nonetheless. Evelyne had dinner ready, venison stew, cornbread, roasted root vegetables. She served it in the dining room, half expecting Garrick to take his plate and retreat to his study. Instead, he sat at the table. Actually sat. Instead of treating the chair like a temporary inconvenience, Ryland joined them, and for several minutes the only sounds were utensils on plates and the wind rattling the windows. Then Garrick cleared his throat. We need to talk about the midwinter gathering. Evelyne looked up. The midwinter gathering was Black Hollow Ridge's biggest social event, a combination business meeting, social occasion, an excuse for frontier families to remember they were part of a community instead of isolated outposts. Every ranch family attended. It was expected. It's in 4 days, Garrick continued. We should discuss... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I'd like you to attend, with me, together. The silence that followed was deafening. For 8 years, Garrick had either attended alone or arrived separately and ignored her all evening. The idea of walking in together, standing together, being seen as an actual couple was so foreign, Evelyne couldn't quite process it. Together? She repeated carefully. Yes, as husband and wife, the way we should have been doing all along. Ryland made a small noise that might have been approval or surprise, but he had the sense to stay quiet. Why? Evelyne asked. Why now? Everyone in town knows how things have been. Showing up together suddenly will just make people talk. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're Garrick Thornvale. You're the powerful ranch lord. I'm the wife everyone pities or mocks. Changing things now will just give them more ammunition. Garrick's jaw tightened. I don't give a damn what they say about me, but I'm tired of letting them say anything about you. This is me. He stopped, forced himself to continue. This is me trying to do what I should have done from the beginning, publicly standing beside you instead of letting you face their judgment alone. It's been 8 years, Garrick. One event isn't going to change what the whole town thinks. Then we'll change it over time, but we have to start somewhere. Evelyne stared at him, looking for the catch, the angle, the way this would somehow turn into another humiliation. But all she saw was tired determination and something that looked almost like desperation. All right, she said quietly. We'll attend together. She saw the relief flash across his face before he controlled it. Thank you. The rest of the meal passed in relative silence, but it felt different from the usual suffocating quiet. More like people thinking instead of people avoiding. After dinner, Ryland excused himself early, claiming exhaustion from storm cleanup. Evelyne suspected he was giving them space, and she both appreciated and resented it. Space meant she and Garrick were alone in the front room, the fire crackling between them, 8 years of history sitting on their shoulders like a physical weight. I meant what I said last night, Garrick said suddenly, about wanting to change, to do better. I know. I don't expect you to trust that immediately. I know I have to prove it. Yes, you do. He nodded, accepting that. Can I ask you something? You can ask. What would better look like to you? What would I need to do differently? The question surprised her. In 8 years, he'd never asked what she wanted or needed. He'd simply established how things would be and expected her to accept it. "I need you to see me," she said slowly. "Actually see me, not just acknowledge I exist. I need conversations, not silence. I need to feel like I'm your partner, not your housekeeper who happens to share your name. I need—" She stopped, the vulnerability catching in her throat. "What?" His voice was gentle in a way that felt unfamiliar. "I need to matter to you as a person, not as an obligation or a role or something to manage, as someone whose happiness and pain and thoughts actually mean something to you." "They do mean something. They've always meant something." "Then why did you spend 8 years acting like they didn't?" He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, but it was too complicated to put into words. He stood abruptly, paced to the window, stared out at the snow-covered darkness. "My father was hard," he said finally. "Not cruel, but hard. He believed emotions made you weak, made you vulnerable to a land that would exploit any weakness. He ran this ranch with iron control, and he raised me the same way. When he died, I was 23 and terrified I couldn't fill his boots. So I became him, cold, controlled, untouchable." Evelyne stayed quiet, sensing this was something he needed to get out. "Then I met you, and you looked at me like I was just a man. Not the Thornvale heir, not the ranch boss, just a man. And I wanted that so badly it scared me. Because wanting things on the frontier is dangerous. Loving things is how you get destroyed when the land takes them away. So I thought if I married you but kept emotional distance, I could have the practical benefits of a wife without the vulnerability of actually caring. That's not how people work. I know that now. I knew it then, probably. But I was 25 and stupid and convinced I could control everything, including my own feelings." He turned from the window to face her. "What I didn't count on was that keeping distance from you would be its own kind of destruction. That I'd spend 8 years watching you fade and hating myself for causing it, but too afraid to do anything different. So what changed? Why now? Hearing you cry out in your sleep like you were dying, realizing I'd created exactly what I was trying to avoid. I lost you anyway, just in a different way. And Ryland coming back, seeing it all through fresh eyes, forcing me to confront what I'd been pretending didn't exist." Evelyne absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. It explained things. Didn't excuse them, but explained them. An explanation was more than she'd had yesterday. "I'm angry at you," she said quietly. "I'm angry at you for wasting 8 years, for making me feel like I wasn't enough, for standing by while people assumed there was something wrong with me, for being a coward when I needed you to be brave. You have every right to be. But I'm also—" She stopped, frustrated by her own conflicting emotions. "I'm also relieved that you finally said something, that there's finally a reason, even if it's a terrible one, that maybe this doesn't have to be my whole life." Garrick crossed back to where she sat, stopped a few feet away like he was afraid to get too close. "What can I do? Right now, today. What can I do to start fixing this?" She thought about it. 8 years of damage couldn't be repaired in a conversation or a gesture, but maybe it could start with something simple. "Talk to me," she said. "Not about the ranch, or the household, or practical things. About you. About what you think and feel and worry about. Treat me like someone you want to know, instead of someone you're obligated to tolerate." He pulled a chair closer, still maintaining distance but less than before, and sat. "All right. What do you want to know? Why did you really ask Ryland to come back?" Garrick's expression shifted, surprise and discomfort crossing his features. "I didn't ask him. He just showed up." "Don't lie to me. Not anymore." He was quiet for a long moment. "I sent him a letter 6 months ago, told him that I wanted him to come home." "Why?" "Because I was drowning. The ranch was fine, the money was fine, everything practical was fine. But I was waking up every day in this house that felt like a tomb, and I realized if I didn't do something, change something, I was going to spend the rest of my life being the ghost my father raised me to be. And I thought maybe if Ryland came back, it would force me to be different, to face things I'd been avoiding." "Did you tell him that in the letter?" "No. I just told him to come home. He probably thought I needed help with the ranch or was dying or something practical." Despite everything, Evelyne almost smiled. "So you manipulated your brother into helping fix your marriage without telling him that's what you were doing. When you say it like that, it sounds bad. It is bad. but it's also the most emotionally strategic thing I've ever heard you admit to doing. She shook her head. You asked him to come home because you needed help being human again. I suppose I did. They sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't the dead silence that usually filled the house. It was the silence of two people thinking, processing, trying to find a way forward through terrain neither of them had mapped. The midwinter gathering, Evelyne said eventually. It's going to be difficult. Everyone will notice the change. There will be questions. Let them question. They'll assume I'm pregnant. That's the only reason they'll believe you'd suddenly start treating me like your wife. Garrick's face tightened. Then we'll correct them. And say what? That you finally decided to stop ignoring me after 8 years? That won't sound any better. I don't care how it sounds. I care about standing beside you and making it clear that anyone who wants to disrespect you will answer to me. The fierceness in his voice was new. Or maybe not new. Maybe it was just the first time it had been directed at protecting her instead of protecting himself. All right, she said. We'll go together. But Garrick, don't make promises you can't keep. If you're going to do this, really do this, you can't change your mind halfway through. I can survive a lot of things, but I can't survive getting hope back just to have it destroyed again. I won't change my mind. You don't know that. You might wake up tomorrow and decide this is too hard or too uncomfortable or too much change, too fast. I won't. How can you be sure? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because for 8 years, I've been dying slowly, becoming less and less of a person, more and more of the cold machine my father wanted me to be. And last night, talking to you, being honest for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt alive again. I'm not giving that up. I'm not going back to being that half-dead thing walking around this house pretending everything's fine. Evelyne wanted to believe him. Every instinct she'd developed over 8 years of self-preservation told her not to, told her to protect herself, to expect disappointment. But there was something in his eyes, something raw and desperate and real, that made her think maybe, just maybe, he meant it. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay. One day at a time. One conversation at a time. One chance. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. He reached out like he was going to take her hand, then stopped himself, uncertain. She made the decision for both of them, reaching across the space between them and taking his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and shaking slightly. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in front of the fire while the wind howled outside and the house settled around them. It wasn't romance. It wasn't passion. It was two people who'd been strangers for 8 years, trying to figure out if they could become something else. Eventually, exhaustion pulled Evelyne toward bed. She stood, and Garrick stood with her, still holding her hand. Good night, she said. Good night. He paused. Thank you for giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet. You haven't earned it. I know, but I will. She left him standing in the front room and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. But when she closed the door and leaned against it, she wasn't crying this time. She was terrified and hopeful and angry and relieved all at once. A mess of emotions that felt more alive than anything she'd experienced in years. Outside her door, she heard Garrick's footsteps in the hallway. They paused near her room. She could see his shadow under the door, then continued to his own room down the hall. Separate bedrooms still. But maybe that was all right for now. Maybe they needed to learn to be in the same room before they could share one. She changed for bed and slid under the covers, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced. In 4 days, she'd walk into the midwinter gathering on Garrick's arm, and the entire town would see the change. They'd talk, they'd speculate, they'd judge. But for the first time in 8 years, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The thought terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm that felt like learning to walk after years of being still. Garrick didn't retreat to his study the way he used to. Instead, he showed up for meals, stayed for conversations that went beyond ranch business, asked questions that required more than one-word answers. It was awkward and stilted, like two people speaking a language neither of them had quite mastered, but it was something. On the second day, he came to find Evelyne in the library where she was cataloging books that hadn't been touched in years. She looked up, startled, when he appeared in the doorway. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. "No, just organizing. Most of these haven't been opened since your father's time." He stepped into the room, looking around like he was seeing it for the first time. My mother used to spend hours in here before she died. Evelyne set down the book she was holding. Garrick almost never talked about his mother. I didn't know that. I was 8 when we lost her. Fever took her in 3 days. He ran his hand along the bookshelf. My father cleared out most of her things after. Said keeping them around made it harder, but he left the books. I think because getting rid of them would have meant admitting she was really gone. I'm sorry. That must have been terrible. It was the last time I saw my father cry. After the funeral, he just shut it off. Told me and Ryland that emotions were a luxury we couldn't afford. That the frontier would take everything we loved if we let ourselves love anything too much. He looked at her. I think that's when I started learning to be the man I became. Evelyne understood suddenly, with painful clarity, why Garrick had built his walls so high. He'd watched his father break and then freeze solid, and he'd learned that freezing was survival. You don't have to be him, she said quietly. I know. I'm trying not to be. It's going to be hard, changing patterns you've had your whole life. I know that too. He moved closer, stopping a few feet away. Can I help? With the books? The question was so ordinary, so domestic, that it nearly broke her. You want to organize books with me? I want to spend time with you doing something that isn't sitting in silence or discussing cattle counts. So yes, I want to organize books with you. They worked side by side for the next hour, sorting volumes by subject and condition, debating whether certain books were worth keeping or too damaged to save. Garrick had opinions about literature she hadn't expected. He'd read more widely than she'd thought, had thoughts about philosophy and history that he'd apparently kept to himself for years. Why didn't you ever tell me you'd read all of these? She asked, holding up a worn copy of a book about Western expansion. You never asked. You never gave me reason to think you'd answer if I did. He acknowledged that with a slight nod. Fair point. They kept working, and the silence that fell between them this time wasn't oppressive. It was almost comfortable, the quiet of two people sharing space without needing to fill every moment with words. Ryland found them there as the afternoon light started to fade, both of them covered in dust, surrounded by stacks of books. He stopped in the doorway, eyebrows raised. Well, this is domestic. Garrick scowled at him. We're organizing. I can see that. I just never thought I'd live to see the day you willingly spent an afternoon doing something that wasn't ranch work. There's a lot you haven't seen. Clearly, Ryland's expression softened. Mrs. Halloway says dinner's ready when you are. Fair warning, she made pot roast, and I'm not above eating your portions if you take too long. After he left, Evelyne brushed dust from her skirt and looked around at their progress. They'd barely made a dent in the room, but it felt like more than organizing books. It felt like reclaiming space that had been abandoned, bringing life back to places that had been dead too long. We could finish this tomorrow, Garrick said. If you want. I'd like that. Something in his face eased, like he'd been afraid she'd say no. They went to dinner together, and when Ryland made a comment about them being joined at the hip suddenly, Garrick didn't retreat or deflect. He just said, I'm making up for lost time. And the simplicity of it, the honest admission, made Evelyne's chest ache. That night, lying in bed, she thought about the slow way things were shifting. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, just small moments stacking on top of each other, building something that might eventually resemble what she'd hoped for 8 years ago. She wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. Garrick had decades of emotional control to unlearn, and she had 8 years of hurt to work through. But for the first time since her wedding day, she could imagine a future that didn't look like an endless repetition of lonely days in a silent house. The morning before the midwinter gathering, Evelyne woke to find snow falling again. Light this time, just enough to freshen the landscape without threatening another storm. She dressed carefully, aware that tonight would be a test, not just of Garrick's commitment to change, but of her own willingness to be vulnerable in front of people who'd spent years pitying or judging her. She was standing in front of her wardrobe, debating between dresses, when someone knocked on her door. Come in. Garrick entered, looking uncertain in a way that was becoming familiar. I wanted to give you this, before tonight. He held out a small wooden box. Evelyne took it, confused. Inside was a necklace, delicate silver chain with a small pendant of polished turquoise, the kind of stone found in the mountains north of Black Hollow Ridge. It was my mother's, Garrick said. My father gave it to her when they married. I should have given it to you 8 years ago, but I kept it locked away, like everything else. She lifted the necklace carefully. The silver was tarnished slightly, but the stone caught the light beautifully. Garrick, I can't. This should go to your children, or you're my wife. It should have been yours from the beginning. He paused. I'd like you to wear it tonight, if you want to. The gesture was small but weighted with meaning. This wasn't just jewelry. It was history, family, the kind of thing you gave to someone who mattered, someone who belonged. Help me put it on? She asked. His hand shook slightly as he fastened the clasp at the back of her neck. His fingers brushed her skin, and she felt him hesitate, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then he stepped back and she turned to face him. It suits you, he said quietly. She would have liked you. My mother. She would have been furious with me for how I've treated you. Probably. Definitely. He managed a small smile. She didn't tolerate foolishness, and I've been a fool. Before Evelyne could respond, Mrs. Halloway called up the stairs about something needing attention in the kitchen. The moment broke, but as Garrick left, he touched her hand briefly, just a brush of fingers, there and gone, and it felt like a promise. The midwinter gathering was held at the largest barn in Black Hollow Ridge, a massive structure that belonged to the Collins family. By the time the Thornvales arrived, the place was already crowded. Ranchers and their families, town merchants, even a few prospectors who'd come down from the mountains for the winter. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over tables laden with food and drink. A makeshift stage at one end held musicians tuning their instruments. Evelyne felt every eye turned to them as they entered. Not just because they were the Thornvales, though Garrick's family name carried weight, but because they were together. Actually together, with Garrick's hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd, instead of disappearing into clusters of men while she stood alone. Thornvale! A ruddy-faced man Evelyne recognized as Samuel Collins pushed through the crowd. Didn't expect you'd make it with all that storm damage. We managed, Garrick said. His hand stayed at Evelyne's back. You remember my wife, Evelyne. It was such a simple thing, introducing her, acknowledging her presence, but it was also something he'd never done before. Samuel blinked, then recovered with forced heartiness. Of course. Of course. Mrs. Thornvale, you're looking well. Thank you, Mr. Collins. The conversation continued, but Evelyne barely tracked it. She was too aware of the whispers starting around them, the looks being exchanged. Martha Henderson leaned to whisper something to Sarah Price. James Morrison's wife actually stopped mid-sentence to stare. The judgment and speculation were so thick she could practically taste them. Garrick must have felt her tension because his hand pressed more firmly against her back. When Samuel finally moved on to greet other arrivals, Garrick leaned close enough that only she could hear. You all right? Everyone's staring. Let them stare. Easy for you to say. I know it's not easy, but I'm here. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Ryland appeared at Garrick's elbow, grinning like he was enjoying some private joke. Brother, sister-in-law, the town gossips are having fits trying to figure out what changed. I've heard 3 theories already, and we've been here less than 5 minutes. What theories? Evelyne asked despite herself. 1. You're pregnant. 2. Garrick had a near-death experience that changed his perspective. 3. I came back and knocked some sense into him. Ryland's grin widened. I'm personally voting for theory 3. Vote for whatever you want, Garrick said dryly. Just go be charming somewhere else for a few minutes. Charming is what I do best. Ryland winked at Evelyne and disappeared into the crowd. The evening progressed in waves of awkwardness and small victories. People approached them, some genuinely friendly, others clearly fishing for information. Garrick stayed close, deflecting intrusive questions and steering conversations away from their marriage. When Martha Henderson made a pointed comment about hoping to hear happy news soon, Garrick's response was cool and final. Our private life is private, Mrs. Henderson. I'm sure you understand. Martha flushed and excused herself quickly. Evelyne wanted to feel triumphant, but mostly she just felt tired. This was going to be her life now if things really changed. Constant scrutiny, endless speculation, people watching to see if the shift was real or temporary. Dinner was announced, and they found seats at one of the long tables. Evelyne ended up between Garrick and a woman named Helen Morris, whose husband ran the general store. Helen was kind enough, asking polite questions about the ranch and the winter preparations, steering clear of anything too personal. Across the table, Ryland held court with a group of younger ranchers, telling stories that made them laugh loud enough to draw disapproving looks from the older generation. "Your brother-in-law is quite the character," Helen said to Evelyne with amusement. "He certainly keeps things interesting." "I imagine his return has been an adjustment. The Thornvale brothers were always fire and ice, even as boys." Evelyne glanced at Garrick, who was deep in conversation with Helen's husband about grain prices. "It's been illuminating." Helen gave her a knowing look. "Change is hard, but sometimes necessary." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her all evening, and Evelyne felt a rush of gratitude for this woman who'd chosen discretion over gossip. After dinner, the musicians started playing, frontier music, rough and cheerful, the kind meant for dancing. Couples took to the cleared space in front of the stage. Evelyne watched them, remembering the handful of social dances she'd attended during her marriage, standing on the edges while Garrick talked business and other women's husbands asked them to dance. "Would you dance with me?" She turned to find Garrick standing, hand extended. Her heart stuttered. "You don't dance." "I do tonight." "Garrick, you hate dancing. I've always been an idiot. Dance with me." She took his hand because refusing would draw more attention than accepting. He led her to the dancing area, and she was acutely aware of conversations pausing, heads turning. This was a spectacle, whether they wanted it to be or not. The music was a simple waltz, and Garrick's hand settled at her waist, while hers rested on his shoulder. They moved together stiffly at first, both of them out of practice, both hyper-aware of being watched. "You're tense," he said quietly. "Everyone's staring at us." "So let them stare. Let them see that I'm done pretending you don't matter." "This is a performance, Garrick. Dancing at one social event doesn't undo 8 years." "I know that, but it's a start." They turned in time with the music, and gradually, so gradually she almost didn't notice, the stiffness eased. Garrick wasn't a natural dancer, but he was competent enough, and there was something almost hypnotic about the repetition of movement, the way their bodies had to work together to stay in rhythm. "I used to imagine this," Evelyne said before she could stop herself. "Early in our marriage, I'd imagine us at dances, actually being a couple instead of strangers who happen to share a name." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I'm sorry you had to imagine it instead of living it." "Are you? Really? Or are you just sorry now because Ryland called you out and you feel guilty?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but she was tired of pretending everything was fine just because he'd decided to try for 3 days. 8 years of loneliness couldn't be smoothed over with a few conversations and a dance. "I'm sorry because I wasted years being afraid," Garrick said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm sorry because you deserved better from the beginning. And yes, Ryland calling me out helped. But he didn't create the guilt. He just made me stop ignoring it." The song ended, but they didn't immediately separate. They stood there in the middle of the dancing area while other couples swirled around them, frozen in something that felt too big to name. "I want to believe you," Evelyne whispered. "I want to believe this is real, but I'm terrified that I'll let myself hope again, and you'll—" "I won't. You can't promise that. People change their minds. People get scared and run. You've been running for 8 years. What makes this time different? Because running nearly destroyed me. Because I'd rather fail trying than succeed at being the cold, dead thing I was becoming." He searched her face. "I can't promise I won't mess this up. I probably will, multiple times, but I can promise I won't run. Not anymore." Someone cleared their throat pointedly, and they realized they were blocking the dance area. They moved to the side, and Garrick's hand slipped from her waist but caught her hand instead, holding it in full view of everyone watching. The rest of the evening blurred. More conversations, more careful navigation of social dynamics. Evelyne caught snippets of speculation, people trying to figure out what had changed, whether it would last, what it meant. She also caught a few looks of genuine happiness from unexpected sources. Helen Morris smiled warmly at her. An older woman named Ruth approached to say she was glad to see the Thornvales looking like a proper couple finally. But there were harder moments too. Margaret Sullivan, whose family rivaled the Thornvales in land and influence, made a point of approaching Garrick when Evelyne had stepped away to get water. "So the Ice King finally thawed," Margaret said, her smile sharp. "How domestic of you, Garrick." though I have to wonder what prompted this sudden change of heart. Evelyne was close enough to hear Garrick's response, cold and cutting. My marriage is my business, Margaret, not yours. Of course, I just find it curious that after years of treating your wife like a piece of furniture, you're suddenly playing the devoted husband. One might think you're trying to convince people of something. One might think you're trying to start trouble where there isn't any. We both know you had your sights set on being Mrs. Thornvale yourself. That ship sailed 8 years ago. Time to let it go. Margaret's face went red. She opened her mouth to respond, but Garrick had already turned away, moving back to Evelyne's side and placing himself between her and Margaret like a barrier. Time to leave, he said quietly. We've been here long enough. They collected Ryland, who looked mildly drunk and thoroughly entertained, and made their way to the wagon. The ride home was quiet except for Ryland's occasional humming and the creak of wheels on frozen ground. Back at the house, Ryland excused himself immediately, claiming exhaustion. Evelyne suspected he was giving them space again, and she wasn't sure whether to thank him or be annoyed by his transparent meddling. She and Garrick stood in the front hall, neither quite sure what to do now that the evening was over. Thank you, Evelyne said finally, for what you said to Margaret, for staying close, for not leaving me to handle it alone. You don't need to thank me for basic decency. Maybe not, but it's more than I've gotten before, so I'm thanking you anyway. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and touched the necklace at her throat, his mother's necklace, the one that marked Evelyne as family instead of an obligation. It really does suit you, he said quietly. Garrick, whatever she was going to say got lost when he leaned in and kissed her forehead, gentle and brief. Then he stepped back, looking almost as surprised as she felt. Good night, Evelyne. Good night. She watched him climb the stairs and disappear down the hallway toward his room. Her hand went to her forehead where she could still feel the warmth of his lips, and her chest ached with the complexity of it all. Anger and hope and fear and something that might have been the first stirrings of actual affection. The next morning brought news that shattered their fragile new peace. Evelyne was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Halloway with breakfast when one of the ranch hands burst through the door, snow-covered and breathing hard. Mrs. Thornvale? Where's Mr. Thornvale? In his study. What's wrong? Raiders hit the Collins Ranch last night, took most of their winter stores and killed 2 of their hands. Samuel sent word. He's asking all the neighboring ranches to meet at his place by noon. Evelyne's blood went cold. Raiders were a constant frontier threat, but they usually hit isolated homesteads, not established ranches. If they were bold enough to hit the Collins place, nowhere was safe. She found Garrick already pulling on his coat, Ryland beside him doing the same. Their faces were grim. How bad? She asked. Bad enough, Garrick said. Samuel's family is scared, half his men are talking about quitting, and if we don't present a united response, the raiders will pick us off one by one through the winter. What are you going to do? Whatever needs doing. This won't just be a meeting. We'll probably be organizing patrols, maybe riding out to track them if the trail's fresh enough. He paused. I don't know when I'll be back. Be careful. Something in her voice made him stop. He crossed to her, took her face in his hands, an intimacy they hadn't shared before, and looked at her intently. I will be. I promise. Don't make promises you can't keep. I can keep this one. He kissed her, properly this time, his mouth warm and desperate against hers. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make her dizzy, enough to remind her of everything they'd lost and might still lose. Then he was gone, and Ryland with him, and Evelyne was left standing in the front hall with her lips still tingling and her heart racing. Ma'am? Mrs. Halloway appeared in the doorway. You all right? No, but I will be. Evelyne straightened her shoulders. We need to secure the house. Check all the locks, make sure the hands know to be vigilant. If raiders are hitting established ranches, we could be next. They spent the day fortifying what they could, checking provisions, making plans for what to do if trouble came. The hours crawled by without word from Garrick or Ryland. By evening, Evelyne was pacing the front room, jumping at every sound. When hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard well after dark, she rushed to the window. But it wasn't Garrick and Ryland returning. It was a single rider, and as he came closer to the house, she recognized Thomas Worth, one of the younger Collins ranch hands. She met him at the door. His face was pale, and not just from the cold. "Mrs. Thornvale, I've got a message from Mr. Collins." "What happened? Where's my husband?" They tracked the raiders to their camp about 15 miles north. There was a confrontation. Mr. Collins sent me back to get the doctor and more men. He said to tell you— The boy swallowed hard. "He said to tell you your husband took a bullet. He's alive, but it's bad." The world tilted. Evelyne grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. "How bad?" "Don't know exactly, ma'am, but they're bringing him back as fast as they can. Should be here within the hour." An hour felt like a lifetime. Evelyne prepared a room downstairs. Getting Garrick up the stairs if he was badly hurt would be impossible, and sent Mrs. Halloway to fetch the doctor who lived 2 miles down the road. She boiled water, gathered clean linens, tried to keep her hands busy so her mind wouldn't spiral into worst-case scenarios. But her mind went there anyway. Garrick, bleeding somewhere in the frozen darkness. Garrick, who just started to let his walls down, who just kissed her like he meant it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. He'd spent 8 years afraid of losing her to the frontier, and now the frontier might take him instead. When she finally heard the wagon, she was out the door before it fully stopped, propriety and caution abandoned. Garrick was in the back, Ryland and Samuel supporting him. Even in the lantern light, she could see the blood soaking through the makeshift bandages around his shoulder and side. "Get him inside," she ordered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Careful with his shoulder. Don't jostle it." They carried him to the prepared room and laid him on the bed. Up close, Evelyne could see how pale he was, how shallow his breathing. His eyes were closed, consciousness clearly tenuous. "What happened?" she demanded. Ryland answered, his own face drawn. "We found their camp. Planned to wait for more men, but they spotted us. Shots were fired. Garrick took one to the shoulder and another grazed his side. Could have been worse. Could have been the head or the heart. But it wasn't, so we work with what we have." The doctor arrived, pushing past them with his bag. "Everyone out except Mrs. Thornvale. I need space and light." The next hour was a blur of following the doctor's instructions, holding Garrick down when the pain broke through his semi-consciousness, watching the doctor extract the bullet from his shoulder with hands that seemed impossibly steady. The smell of blood and whiskey, used to clean the wound, filled the room. Garrick's hand found hers at some point, gripping so hard she thought bones might break, but she didn't pull away. "Will he live?" she asked when the doctor finally stepped back. "If infection doesn't set in, yes. The shoulder wound is clean now, and the side graze isn't deep. But the next few days are critical. He needs rest, fluids, and someone watching for fever." "I'll watch him." "I expect you will." The doctor packed his instruments. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on him. Send for me immediately if he takes a turn for the worse." After he left, Evelyne sat in the chair beside the bed, still holding Garrick's hand. His breathing had evened out, laudanum for the pain, and some color had returned to his face. But he looked vulnerable in a way she'd never seen, stripped of all his careful control. Ryland appeared in the doorway. "How is he?" "Alive. The doctor thinks he'll make it if we can keep infection away." "That's good. That's—" Ryland's voice cracked slightly. "He's an idiot, you know. Charged in like he was invincible. Nearly got himself killed. That seems to run in the family." Despite everything, Ryland smiled. "Fair point." He sobered. "We got 3 of the raiders, the others scattered. Samuel's organizing a larger group to hunt them down, but it'll be a few days before they ride out." "Good." "Evelyne, before when we were riding back, Garrick kept saying your name. Delirious from blood loss, barely conscious, but he kept saying your name like it was the only thing keeping him tethered." Her throat tightened. "Stop. I just thought you should know. Whatever he's been, whatever mistakes he's made, you matter to him. Maybe more than anything else." After Ryland left, Evelyne sat in the darkness, listening to Garrick breathe. She thought about the past 3 days, the conversations, the small gestures, the dance, the kiss. She thought about 8 years of loneliness and silence, and she thought about the terror she'd felt hearing he'd been shot, the way her world had narrowed to a single desperate prayer. "Please don't let him die, not now, not when we're finally trying." "You're an idiot," she whispered to his sleeping form. "Spending 8 years pushing me away because you were afraid of losing me, and then you go and get yourself shot. If you die, Garrick Thornvale, I will never forgive you." His hand twitched in hers, but he didn't wake. She settled in for what she knew would be a long night, determined to keep watch, to make sure he kept breathing, to be there when he finally opened his eyes. Because somewhere in the past few days, without quite meaning to, she'd started to hope again. And hope, she was learning, was both the most dangerous and the most essential thing a person could carry on the frontier. Garrick's fever started just before dawn. Evelyne had dozed off in the chair beside his bed, her hand still wrapped around his, when she jerked awake to find him burning hot to the touch. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the winter cold seeping through the windows. "No," she whispered, pressing her palm to his forehead. "No, no, no." She'd watched frontier fever kill strong men in a matter of days. She'd seen infection turn minor wounds into death sentences. The doctor had warned her, but knowing it was possible and facing it in the gray pre-dawn light were two different things entirely. Mrs. Halloway appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. The woman must have been up since before sunrise, preparing for the worst. "Fever?" she asked quietly. "Yes. We need cool water, clean cloths. Send someone for the doctor." They worked in practice tandem, changing the bandages, checking for red streaks radiating from the wounds that would signal blood poisoning. So far, the wounds themselves looked clean, but that could change within hours. Evelyne bathed Garrick's face and chest with cool water, trying to bring his temperature down while Mrs. Halloway prepared willow bark tea for when he woke. He didn't wake. Not properly. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering things that didn't make sense, fragments about cattle, about his father, about things Evelyne couldn't parse. Once, his eyes opened and seemed to focus on her face. "Evelyne?" His voice was rough, barely there. "I'm here. Don't try to talk." "Shouldn't have," he grimaced, pain cutting through the fever haze. "Shouldn't have waited so long. Garrick, save your strength." "No. Need to say it." His hand tightened weakly around hers. "Love you. Should have said it years ago. Should have." The words cut off as he slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving Evelyne frozen in her chair, heart hammering. He'd said it, delirious with fever, barely coherent, but he'd said the words she'd stopped believing she'd ever hear. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Halloway's voice was gentle. "You're crying." Evelyne touched her face, surprised to find tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm fine." "You're exhausted. You've been up all night. Let me take over for a few hours while you rest." "I can't. If he wakes up, if something happens, then I'll come get you immediately. But you're no good to him if you collapse." Mrs. Halloway's expression was kind but firm. "Rest. Even just an hour. That's an order, ma'am." Evelyne wanted to argue, but exhaustion was winning. She made Mrs. Halloway promise, twice, to wake her if anything changed, then dragged herself upstairs to her room. She meant to lie down for just a few minutes, but the moment her head hit the pillow, sleep pulled her under like a riptide. She woke to afternoon light and panic. How long had she been asleep? What if Garrick had gotten worse? What if he'd... She was down the stairs before she'd fully registered moving, bursting into the sick room to find the doctor bent over Garrick, Ryland standing watch in the corner. Her heart stopped. "What happened?" The doctor looked up, his expression neutral. "Fever broke about an hour ago. He's not out of danger yet, but the worst seems to have passed. The relief hit her so hard she had to grab the doorframe. He's going to live. Barring complications, yes. The wounds are clean, no sign of blood poisoning. He's young and strong. He should make a full recovery, though it'll take time." Evelyne moved to the bedside. Garrick was sleeping peacefully now, his breathing steady, his color better than it had been in hours. She touched his forehead, still warm, but not the dangerous heat from earlier. "Thank you," she said to the doctor. "Don't thank me yet. He's got a long road ahead. The shoulder wound was serious. He'll need to take it easy for weeks, maybe months, and that's assuming he follows orders, which I doubt." The doctor packed his bag. "I'll be back tomorrow. Keep him hydrated, change the bandages twice daily, and for the love of all that's holy, don't let him try to get up and do ranch work." After he left, Ryland moved closer. "You should have seen his face when Mrs. Halloway told him you'd been up all night. He tried to get out of bed to check on you. Took both of us to keep him down. He's an idiot." "Yeah, well, he's our idiot." Ryland squeezed her shoulder. I'm going to check on the hands, make sure things are running smooth. You good here? She nodded, and once she was alone with Garrick, she pulled the chair close again and took his hand. His fingers curled around hers instinctively, and she wondered if he knew she was there even in sleep. Hours passed. Mrs. Halloway brought food that Evelyne barely touched. The sun set, and she lit lamps, determined to keep the room warm and bright. She was reading aloud from one of the books they'd been organizing, something about Western exploration that she thought he'd like, when his eyes finally opened. Evelyne? She set the book aside. Welcome back. How long was I? He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain flashing across his face. Don't move. You were shot, remember? The doctor says you'll recover, but only if you don't do anything stupid. Stupid seems to be my specialty lately. His voice was weak but clear. Water? She helped him drink, supporting his head carefully. When he'd had enough, he leaned back against the pillows and studied her face. You look terrible. You were shot, and you've been delirious with fever for almost 24 hours. I'm allowed to look terrible. I meant you look exhausted. Have you slept at all? Some. Mrs. Halloway forced me to rest earlier. Good. He closed his eyes briefly. I remember pieces. The doctor. You holding my hand. Did I say something about... You said a lot of things. Most of it didn't make sense. He opened his eyes again, searching her face. But some of it did? She could pretend she didn't know what he meant, could deflect, protect herself from the vulnerability of acknowledging what he'd said. But she was tired of pretending, tired of protecting herself at the cost of everything else. You said you loved me, that you should have said it years ago. The silence that followed felt massive. Garrick didn't look away, didn't try to take it back or claim fever-induced nonsense. I meant it, he said quietly. I've meant it for longer than I'm willing to admit. I just didn't have the courage to say it until I thought I might not get another chance. That's convenient, declaring love when you're half dead, and I can't exactly argue with you. You could argue. You'd be justified. I'm too tired to argue, and you're too injured for me to yell at properly. She kept her hand in his. But when you're better, we're going to have a very long conversation about this. I'm looking forward to it. A ghost of his usual dry humor crossed his face. Never thought I'd say that about a difficult conversation, but here we are. Despite everything, she almost smiled. Here we are. Over the next few days, Garrick proved to be a terrible patient. He tried to read ranch reports from bed until Evelyne confiscated them. He attempted to get up and walk around until dizziness sent him crashing back to the mattress. He argued with the doctor's orders, with Mrs. Halloway's meal choices, with Ryland's insistence that he wasn't needed for daily operations. I'm not an invalid, he growled on the third day when Evelyne stopped him from trying to stand on his own. No, you're just a stubborn fool who got shot and apparently wants to undo all the doctor's work. I need to know what's happening with the ranch. The raiders could come back. The winter supplies need managing. The ranch is fine. Ryland and I are managing things. The hands know what they're doing. You lying in bed recovering is not going to bring everything crashing down. He glared at her, frustrated and helpless in equal measure. I don't know how to just lie here and do nothing. Then learn, because you don't have a choice. She softened slightly. Garrick, you nearly died. You were burning with fever and bleeding out. The least you can do is give yourself time to heal. Some of the fight went out of him. I hate this, feeling weak, useless. You're not useless. You're recovering. There's a difference. She sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, mindful of his injuries, and took his hand. The gesture was becoming familiar, this casual intimacy they were building one small moment at a time. Tell me what you're really worried about, she said. He was quiet for a long time. That if I let my guard down, if I stop being in control of everything, it'll all fall apart. The ranch, the safety of our people, us. Us isn't going to fall apart because you're resting. How do you know? Because I'm not going anywhere. Because we're building something that's stronger than you being injured or things being difficult. Because... She stopped, the words catching. Because what? Because I meant what I said. You get one chance, and that chance doesn't end just because you got shot being heroically stupid. He studied her face, and something in his expression shifted. You were terrified. When they brought me back. I saw it in your eyes before I passed out. Of course I was terrified. You were bleeding everywhere and barely conscious. But it was more than that. You weren't just scared. You were scared of losing me specifically. Not just afraid of being a widow or alone. You were afraid of losing me. She wanted to deny it, to keep that vulnerability locked away where it couldn't be used against her. But what was the point? He'd already seen the truth. Yes, she said simply. I was afraid of losing you, which is terrifying in itself because 3 weeks ago I wasn't sure I'd even miss you if you were gone. And now I'm sitting here having conversations with you that we should have had 8 years ago. Now I'm reading to you from books we organized together. Now I'm holding your hand and trying to figure out if what we're building is real or just crisis-induced temporary insanity. It's real. His certainty was absolute. At least it is for me. I can't speak for you. I don't know yet. I want it to be real, but wanting something and trusting it are different things. Fair enough? He squeezed her hand gently. Then I'll just have to keep proving it until you believe it. The conversation was interrupted by Ryland appearing with urgent news. Another ranch had been hit, smaller than the Collins place, but the raiders had killed the owner and his eldest son. Fear was spreading through the valley like wildfire. Samuel's calling an emergency meeting, Ryland said, his face grim. Every ranch owner in the region, tomorrow at noon. I'll be there, Garrick said immediately. You can barely stand. I don't care, this is serious. If we don't organize a coordinated response, then I'll go, Evelyne interrupted. Both men turned to stare at her. What? I'm the Thornvale representative. I know the ranch operations as well as either of you, and unlike Garrick, I can actually sit upright for more than 10 minutes without looking like I'm going to pass out. Evelyne, no, these men won't listen to a woman. They'll what? Dismiss me? Ignore me? They've been doing that for 8 years anyway. She crossed her arms. I'm going. You can argue if you want, but you're injured and I'm not. Which means I win. Garrick looked like he wanted to protest, but pain and exhaustion were written across every line of his face. He knew she was right, even if it killed him to admit it. Fine. But take Ryland with you. And if anyone gives you trouble, I'll handle it. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. Try not to do anything stupid while I'm gone. The next day, Evelyne dressed in her most severe dress, dark blue wool, high-necked, no ornamentation, and pinned her hair up with extra care. She looked like a frontier widow, stern and uncompromising, and that was exactly the impression she wanted. Mrs. Halloway helped her into her heavy coat, and Ryland brought the wagon around. You sure about this? He asked as they started toward the Collins ranch. No, but I'm doing it anyway. You know they're going to test you. These men, they respect Garrick because he's hard and ruthless and doesn't back down. They're not going to automatically extend that respect to you. Then I'll earn it, the same way Garrick did. The Collins barn was packed when they arrived. Evelyne recognized most of the faces, ranch owners, a few town officials, men who'd spent years treating her like wallpaper at social gatherings. The conversation died when she walked in. Samuel Collins recovered first. Mrs. Thornvale, we weren't expecting... Where's Garrick? Recovering from the bullet wound he took defending this valley. I'm here in his place. A murmur went through the crowd. Thomas Price, a heavy-set man who ran a large cattle operation, stepped forward. With all respect, ma'am, this is a discussion about security and defense. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable waiting outside while we... No! Her voice cut through his condescension like a blade. I'm not more comfortable anywhere, except in this discussion. I run the Thornvale household accounts. I know our livestock numbers, our winter supplies, our vulnerabilities. I know this ranch better than half the men in this room know their own. So unless you're planning to bar me physically, I'm staying. The silence that followed was electric. She could see the calculations happening, some men angry at her presumption, others curious, a few actually impressed. Samuel looked between her and Thomas, clearly torn. Let her stay, said a voice from the back. Helen Morris's husband, James. If Garrick trusts her to represent Thornvale interests, that's good enough for me. Others grumbled, but no one actively objected. Evelyne took a position near the front, Ryland at her shoulder, and forced herself to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Samuel cleared his throat. Right. As you all know, the Brennan Ranch was hit 2 nights ago. David and his boy are dead, The raiders took everything, livestock, supplies, even stripped the house. This is the third attack in 2 weeks. We need a coordinated response. We need to hunt them down, Thomas Price said. Organize a large enough group and track them to wherever they're holing up. That's suicide, someone else countered. We don't know how many there are. Could be a dozen, could be 50. Riding out blind could get us all killed. So we just sit here and wait to be picked off one by one? The argument escalated quickly, voices overlapping, everyone talking and no one listening. Evelyne watched it spiral for several minutes before she'd had enough. Stop! Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos. Everyone turned to stare at her. Arguing gets us nowhere. We need information, strategy, and coordination. In that order. Thomas Price scoffed. And what would you know about strategy, Mrs. Thornvale? More than you apparently, since you're suggesting we ride out looking for an enemy we can't quantify with no plan beyond hunt them down. That's not strategy. That's how you get your men killed. Several people shifted uncomfortably. She pressed on. First, we need better intelligence. Who are these raiders? Where are they operating from? What's their pattern? They've hit 3 places. What do those places have in common besides proximity? Samuel frowned, thinking. They're all at least 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. Isolated. Exactly. They're choosing targets that can't get help quickly, which means ranches closer to town or with near neighbors are safer. She looked around the room. How many of you fit that vulnerable profile? A handful of hands went up reluctantly. Those ranches need reinforced security immediately. Extra hands, better weapons, communication plans with neighbors. Meanwhile, the less vulnerable ranches contribute men to organized patrols. Not hunting parties, patrols. Regular routes, specific times, coordinated check-ins. If the raiders know we're watching, they'll either move on or make a mistake. James Morris nodded slowly. That's actually sensible. It's also expensive, Thomas Price pointed out. Hiring extra security, organizing patrols, who's paying for all that? We all are. Proportional to our holdings. The Thornvales will contribute our share and then some. She looked directly at Thomas. Unless you're more worried about short-term costs than long-term survival? He flushed but didn't argue. Samuel stepped in. Mrs. Thornvale's right. We pool resources, we coordinate, we protect the most vulnerable first. Anyone disagree? There were grumbles, but no outright objections. They spent the next 2 hours hammering out details, patrol schedules, security allocations, emergency communication protocols. Evelyne contributed throughout, offering practical suggestions based on her knowledge of Thornvale operations. Some men still bristled at taking advice from a woman, but she noticed others starting to listen, actually consider what she said. By the time the meeting ended, she was exhausted, but satisfied. They'd accomplished more than just a defensive plan. They'd established that Evelyne Thornvale was a force to be reckoned with, not someone who could be dismissed or ignored. On the ride home, Ryland was grinning. That was incredible. Did you see Price's face when you called him out? I saw. Think I made some enemies today. Maybe. But you made allies too. And you earned respect, the kind Garrick spent years building. You did it in one meeting. We'll see if it lasts. Back at the estate, she found Garrick awake and clearly agitated. He tried to sit up when she entered. How did it go? What did they decide? Did anyone give you trouble? Lie down before you tear your stitches. She removed her coat and settled into the chair beside him. It went fine. Better than fine, actually. We have a coordinated defense plan, patrol schedules, and security reinforcements for vulnerable ranches. They listened to you? Most of them. The ones who didn't learn quickly that I'm not easily dismissed. She filled him in on the details, watching his expression shift from worry to surprise to something that looked almost like pride. You did all that? Don't sound so shocked. I've been running this household for 8 years. Organization and strategic planning aren't exactly foreign concepts. I know, He shook his head. I've been an even bigger fool than I thought. All this time, you could have been my partner in running this place instead of just managing the house. I wasted your skills as thoroughly as I wasted everything else. Well, you can start making up for it now by actually listening when I tell you things about ranch operations. Deal. He caught her hand. Evelyne, I'm serious. What you did today, stepping in when I couldn't, handling those men, creating an actual plan, that's what a real partnership looks like. That's what we should have been from the beginning. We can't change the past. We can only work with what we have now. Then let's work with it. Really work with it. When I'm healed, I want you involved in every aspect of the ranch, not just the household. Your mind is too good to waste on just managing supplies and social calendars. It was what she'd wanted for years, to be seen as more than just the woman who lived in the house, to be valued for her intelligence and capabilities, to be a true partner instead of an ornament. "All right," she said quietly. "Partners, partners." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "Thank you for stepping up today, for taking care of things while I couldn't, for not giving up on this mess I've made. Don't thank me yet, you're still on probation." Despite the serious conversation, he smiled. "How long is this probationary period?" "However long it takes for me to trust that this is real and not just crisis-induced temporary change." "Fair enough. I'll spend however long it takes proving it." The days that followed settled into a new routine. Garrick healed slowly but steadily, his strength returning in increments. The patrol system Evelyne had helped organize proved effective. No new raids in the first week, and when raiders were spotted near the Patterson Ranch, the coordinated response drove them off before any damage could be done. Word spread about how Evelyne had handled the emergency meeting, and the town's perception of her shifted. Women who'd pitied her started seeking her out for advice. Men who'd dismissed her began nodding respectfully when she spoke. The change wasn't universal. Margaret Sullivan still sneered and Thomas Price still bristled. But it was significant. At home, Garrick kept his promise about partnership. When he was well enough to review ranch reports from bed, he asked Evelyne's opinions on decisions. When she had ideas about improving operations, he listened instead of dismissing them. When the winter supply calculations needed updating, they worked on them together. But it wasn't all smooth. They still had arguments about his recovery timeline, about ranch priorities, about things neither of them could quite articulate. The weight of 8 years didn't disappear just because they decided to try. Sometimes the hurt surfaced unexpectedly, old wounds opening when she'd thought they were healing. 2 weeks after the shooting, Garrick was finally allowed out of bed for short periods. Evelyne helped him to the library, their library now, where they'd started organizing books together, and he settled into a chair by the window while she brought him tea. "I've been thinking," he said, watching snow fall outside, "about everything that's happened, the shooting, the raiders, you stepping up at that meeting, about how close I came to dying without ever really living." "That's cheerful." "I'm serious. I spent 8 years being so afraid of losing you that I lost you anyway. Then I nearly died for real, and all I could think about was how much time I'd wasted being a coward. Where are you going with this?" He turned from the window to face her. "I want to do things differently, not just in how we interact, but in how we live. I don't want to wait to be happy. I don't want to put off conversations or moments or anything else because I'm afraid of what might happen tomorrow." "That sounds nice in theory. How does it work in practice?" "I don't know yet, but I want to figure it out with you, really with you, not in separate rooms living separate lives." He paused. "I want you to move into my room, our room. I want to fall asleep beside you and wake up next to you and stop pretending we're not married." The request shouldn't have surprised her. They'd been building toward something like this for weeks. But it still made her heart race, fear and desire tangling together. "Garrick, that's too fast? Too much?" "I know. But I'm tired of slow when slow cost us 8 years. I'm tired of careful when careful kept us strangers. I want to actually try at this marriage, and that means sharing more than just conversations and hand-holding. And if I'm not ready, then I'll wait, however long it takes. But I'm asking. I'm putting it out there instead of hiding behind distance and fear." Evelyne looked at him, really looked at him. The man who'd ignored her for 8 years. The man who'd finally admitted he was wrong. The man who'd taken a bullet defending the valley and then declared love while delirious with fever. The man who was asking her to trust him with her heart when he'd already broken it once. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of letting you close and having you pull away again. I'm scared of believing this is real and waking up one day to find you've decided it's too hard and gone back to being cold. I understand that. I can't promise I won't mess up or say the wrong thing or handle situations badly, but I can promise I won't pull away. Not again. Not ever." "How can you be sure?" "Because pulling away nearly killed me. Because I'd rather fail trying to love you than succeed at being alone. Because he stood carefully, crossing to where she sat, and knelt in front of her despite his healing shoulder. Because you're the only person who's ever made me want to be more than the cold, controlled thing my father raised. And I'm not giving that up. I'm not giving you up. She looked down at him, proud, stubborn Garrick Thornvale on his knees, asking for something he couldn't demand or control. The vulnerability in his face was almost painful to witness. "All right," she whispered. "All right? All right. I'll move into your room. Our room. I'll try. But Garrick, if you hurt me again, if you go back to being that stranger who ignored me for 8 years, I won't give you another chance. I can't. This is it." "This is it," he agreed. "One chance. I won't waste it." He pulled her down into a kiss that was deeper and more desperate than the brief one before he'd left to confront the raiders. His hands framed her face like she was something precious and breakable, and she kissed him back with 8 years of loneliness and anger and desperate hope pouring through her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said clearly. No fever-induced delirium to blame it on. "I've loved you longer than I've admitted, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it if you'll let me." "I'm not there yet," she said honestly. "Loving you back. I want to be, but I'm not there yet." "That's all right. I'll wait." "What if you're waiting forever?" "Then I'll wait forever. You're worth waiting for." They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync, the library quiet around them except for the wind outside and the pop of the fire in the hearth. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending to their years of struggle, but it was honest and real and more than they'd had before. That night, Evelyne moved her things to Garrick's room. It felt strange and terrifying and right all at once, hanging her dresses next to his coats, placing her brush beside his on the dresser, climbing into a bed that would now be theirs instead of his or hers. He was already there, propped against the pillows with a book, and he looked up when she entered in her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." She climbed into bed beside him, and he set the book aside to pull her close, carefully, mindful of his healing shoulder. She settled against him, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "This is strange," she murmured. "Good, strange, or bad strange?" "I don't know yet, just strange." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We'll figure it out, together." Together. The word had weight now that it hadn't before. They'd been married for 8 years, but they'd never really been together. Now, finally, they were trying to build something real from the wreckage of what should have been. Outside, the frontier winter continued its assault. Snow and wind and brutal cold that killed the weak and tested the strong. But inside their room, in their bed, wrapped in each other's warmth, Evelyne let herself hope that maybe they were strong enough to survive it. Strong enough to survive each other. Strong enough to build something lasting from the ashes of everything they'd destroyed. Learning to share a life after 8 years of living as strangers was harder than either of them expected. The first week of sleeping in the same bed brought a dozen small conflicts. Garrick read late with the lamp burning, Evelyne woke early and wanted the curtains open. They had different tolerances for cold and kept adjusting the fire. Trivial things that wouldn't have mattered if they'd built intimacy gradually, but felt monumental when compressed into sudden proximity. The third night, Evelyne woke at 2 a.m. to find Garrick sitting up in bed, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. What's wrong?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "I keep thinking about all the nights I could have been here, all the years I wasted sleeping alone in this room while you were down the hall. And I don't know how to forgive myself for that." She sat up beside him. "You can't change it. We can only move forward." "I know, but moving forward doesn't erase what was lost." "No, it doesn't." She took his hand. "But if we spend all our time mourning what we wasted, we'll waste what we have now too." He looked at her in the darkness, the moon through the window casting half his face in shadow. "How are you not angrier? I took 8 years from you, from us. How do you just accept that and move on?" "Who says I've accepted it? I'm furious. Some days I look at you and I want to scream about everything you stole. But I'm also trying to build something new, and I can't do that if I'm drowning in rage about the past." "So you just bury it?" No, I feel it, acknowledge it, and then choose not to let it consume me. There's a difference. She shifted to face him more fully. Garrick, I'm not some saint who's forgiven everything. I'm a woman who's tired of being angry and lonely. I'm choosing to try because the alternative is spending the rest of my life bitter about what could have been. And that sounds worse than taking a risk on what might still be possible. He pulled her close, carefully still mindful of his healing shoulder. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. They lay back down together, and this time when sleep came, it came easier. January gave way to February, and the winter deepened its grip on Black Hollow Ridge. The organized patrols continued keeping raiders at bay, and slowly the valley started to feel safer. Garrick healed enough to start working again, against doctors' orders and Evelyne's protests, but he kept his promise about partnership. Every major decision got discussed with her first. Every problem got tackled together. The real test came when a supply crisis hit. One of the freight companies that usually serviced the valley went bankrupt midwinter, leaving multiple ranches without expected deliveries of essential supplies. The Thornvales were better positioned than most. Evelyne's careful inventory management meant they had reserves, but several smaller ranches were facing genuine shortages. We need to help them, Evelyne said, reviewing the numbers at the desk in their room. The Patterson family especially. They've got 4 young children and they're already stretching supplies thin. Garrick frowned at the ledger. If we distribute our reserves, we'll be cutting our own margins close. One unexpected problem and we could be in trouble ourselves. So we take that risk. Evelyne, I appreciate the charitable impulse, but we have to think practically. We can't save everyone. I'm not asking to save everyone. I'm asking to help the families who'll starve without intervention. The Pattersons, the Worthies, maybe the Collins if they're willing to accept help. The Collins have more resources than they're admitting. Samuel's just tight with money. Then we focus on the ones who genuinely need it. She looked at him. We have the means. We have the surplus. What's the point of being the wealthiest ranch in the valley if we hoard resources while our neighbors suffer? The point is surviving. Being generous is easy when times are good. But this is the frontier, one bad season, one disaster, and generous people end up as dead as everyone else. The argument escalated from there, both of them stubborn, both convinced they were right. It ended with Garrick leaving for the barn and Evelyne staying in their room, furious and hurt that he'd revert to cold pragmatism just when she thought he'd changed. She was still angry an hour later when Ryland knocked on the door. Can I come in? If you're here to take Garrick's side, you can save your breath. He entered anyway, settling into the chair by the window. I'm not taking sides, but I think you should know why he's so resistant to this. Because he's calculating and cold and can't see past numbers on a ledger? Because our father nearly bankrupted this ranch being generous. Ryland's tone was serious. When Garrick was 19, there was a bad winter, worse than this one. Father helped every struggling family in the valley, gave away supplies, livestock, even money. And when our own crisis hit that spring, we had nothing left. We almost lost everything. Father managed to save the ranch, but it broke something in him. Made him hard. Evelyne sat down slowly. Garrick never told me that. He probably doesn't even think about it consciously anymore. But it shaped how he approaches everything. He learned that generosity could destroy you as surely as greed, that you had to protect your own first or risk losing everything. That doesn't make it right. No, but it explains it. Ryland stood. For what it's worth, I think you're right. We should help, but maybe understanding where Garrick's coming from will make it easier to convince him. After he left, Evelyne sat thinking. She'd spent 8 years seeing Garrick as simply cold and unfeeling, but every new piece of his history revealed layers of fear and survival instinct that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with a boy who'd watched his father almost destroy their legacy through kindness. She found Garrick in the barn, checking on the horses. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded. I'm still angry, she said without preamble. But Ryland told me about your father, about what happened when you were 19. His jaw tightened. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this. You're making decisions based on fear of repeating his mistakes. I'm making decisions based on practical reality. Generosity killed my father, not literally, but it killed the man he was. I watched him give everything away and then scramble to save us. I'm not doing that. I'm not asking you to give everything away. I'm asking you to help a few families who are genuinely struggling. There's a difference between reckless generosity and calculated compassion. He leaned against the stall door, exhaustion written across his face. What if you're wrong? What if helping them leaves us vulnerable and something goes wrong? Then we deal with it, together, as partners. She moved closer. Garrick, you spent 8 years trying to protect yourself from loss by pushing me away. Don't spend the rest of your life trying to protect this ranch from disaster by hoarding resources we don't need. That's just another version of the same fear. It's not the same, isn't it? You're so afraid of what might happen that you won't take any risk at all. But life on the frontier is risk. Marriage is risk. Love is risk. You can't eliminate danger by refusing to be vulnerable. You just eliminate the possibility of anything meaningful. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You're right." "I'm what?" "You're right. I'm doing exactly what I did with you, protecting myself from potential pain by refusing to engage. And you're right that it's another version of the same fear." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to stop being afraid. It's been my default setting for so long." "You don't stop being afraid. You just don't let fear make all your decisions." She took his hand. "Help me with this. Let's figure out how to help these families without destroying ourselves. We're smart enough to find a middle path." They spent the next 2 hours working through numbers, identifying which families needed the most help, calculating exactly how much they could spare without risking their own stability. It was compromise and collaboration, the kind of partnership Evelyne had wanted from the beginning. Over the next week, they quietly distributed supplies to struggling families. The Pattersons received enough grain and preserved food to see them through to spring. The Worthies got assistance with feed for their livestock. Even the Collins accepted help with medical supplies after their youngest child fell ill. Word spread, and the valley's perception of the Thornvales shifted again. They weren't just the wealthy, powerful ranch family anymore. They were neighbors who'd stepped up when times got hard. It built goodwill that couldn't be bought, and alliances that would last beyond the winter. But the real victory wasn't in public perception. It was watching Garrick learn to trust that generosity didn't have to mean destruction, that caring about people beyond himself didn't make him weak. February turned to March, and the first hints of spring started appearing. Longer days, occasional warm winds that promised the winter's end. Garrick's shoulder healed completely, leaving only a scar he sometimes touched absently. The raiders moved on to easier targets in other territories. Life on the Thornvale estate settled into rhythms that felt sustainable, even comfortable. Evelyne was in the kitchen one afternoon, reviewing the week's menu with Mrs. Halloway, when Garrick appeared looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. "In private?" She followed him to the library, their library, where they'd first started rebuilding their connection. He paced for a moment before turning to face her. "I want to do something, and I need to know if you're ready for it." "That's ominous. What is it?" "I want to renew our vows, publicly, in front of the whole town." She stared at him. "What?" 8 years ago, I made promises I didn't keep. I stood up in front of everyone and swore to honor you, cherish you, be a partner to you. And then I failed at every single one of those promises." He moved closer. "I want to do it again. But this time, I want to mean it. I want everyone to see that I'm choosing you, that we're choosing each other, that this marriage is real." "Garrick, people will talk. They'll have opinions about why we're doing it." "Let them talk. Let them have opinions. I don't care what they think anymore. I care what you think. I care about proving to you that this isn't temporary or crisis-induced. It's permanent. It's real. And I want to declare that as publicly as possible." Evelyne's throat tightened. "You really want this?" "More than anything. But only if you do. If it's too much, if you're not ready, we don't have to. I want you to know that I'm ready, that I'm all in." She thought about the woman she'd been at 19, hopeful and naive, marrying a man she barely knew. She thought about the woman she'd become at 27, worn down by years of loneliness, but not broken. And she thought about who she might become if she kept taking these terrifying steps toward vulnerability. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." His smile was brighter than anything she'd seen on his face before. "Yeah? Yeah, but Garrick, if we do this, If we stand up there and make promises to each other, you have to keep them this time. No retreating when things get hard. No shutting down when you're scared. You have to actually show up. I will, every day. However imperfectly, I'll show up. They planned the ceremony for late March, timing it with the first real thaw. It wouldn't be as elaborate as a traditional wedding. Frontier practicality didn't allow for excess, but it would be witnessed and official and meaningful. The night before, Evelyne couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Garrick, watching moonlight track across the ceiling, thinking about the 8 years that had led to this moment. All the pain and waste and loneliness, but also the slow, difficult rebuilding. The conversations, the compromises, the choosing each other day after day, even when it was hard. "You awake?" Garrick's voice came soft in the darkness. "Yeah." "Nervous?" "Terrified." "You?" "Same." He rolled to face her. "I keep thinking about how different tomorrow will be from 8 years ago. How different I am. How different we are. Is that good or bad?" "Good. Definitely good. 8 years ago, I was a coward pretending to be strong. Tomorrow I get to be honest about being scared, but trying anyway. That feels stronger." She touched his face in the darkness. "I still get angry sometimes. About the years we lost. I don't know if that'll ever fully go away. I don't expect it to. I get angry about it too. But Evelyne, I love you. I'm in love with you. And I think maybe I have been since the beginning. I was just too afraid to admit it. Tomorrow, I get to say that in front of everyone. That's worth whatever judgment or gossip comes with it." "I'm getting there," she said quietly. "The being in love part. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. That's enough. More than enough." The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of March morning where winter and spring fought for dominance. Evelyne dressed carefully in a new dress she'd made for the occasion, deep green wool, fitted but practical, with her mother's cameo at the throat and Garrick's mother's necklace around her neck. She looked like herself, not like she was trying to be someone else. That felt important. The ceremony was held in the same church where they'd married 8 years prior, but everything else was different. The crowd was smaller, just people who actually mattered, not society obligated to attend. Helen Morris was there, and James, Samuel Collins and his family. Ryland stood as Garrick's witness, grinning like he'd personally orchestrated the whole thing. When Evelyne walked down the aisle, alone this time, choosing to give herself rather than being given, she saw Garrick waiting at the front, and something inside her chest cracked open. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, and the vulnerability in his face was almost painful to witness. The minister kept the ceremony brief, understanding that frontier people didn't have patience for lengthy oratory. When it came time for vows, Garrick spoke first. 8 years ago, I made promises I didn't keep. I was too afraid to be the husband you deserved. Too afraid to risk vulnerability. Too afraid to love you the way you should have been loved from the beginning. His voice was steady but raw. I can't give you back those years. I can't erase the hurt or the loneliness or the damage. But I can promise you every day I have left. I can promise to show up even when I'm scared, to talk instead of withdrawing, to be your partner in everything, not just in name. I can promise to love you openly, honestly, and completely. And I swear on everything I am, I will keep these promises. You deserve nothing less. Evelyne's turn came, and she'd prepared words, but they felt inadequate now. So she spoke from the heart instead. I'm not going to pretend the past 8 years didn't hurt. They did. I won't pretend I've completely forgiven or forgotten. I haven't. But I've learned that love isn't about perfect people making perfect choices. It's about imperfect people choosing each other anyway. Choosing to try even when it's terrifying. Choosing to build something new from the wreckage of what failed. She looked directly at Garrick. I choose you. I choose us. I choose this messy, difficult, imperfect partnership we're building, and I promise to keep choosing it, even on the days when it would be easier to walk away. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause, but Evelyne barely heard it. She was too focused on the man holding her, on the promise they'd just made, on the terrifying hope blooming in her chest that maybe this time it would be different. The reception was held at the Thornvale estate, which felt symbolically appropriate. The house that had been a tomb for 8 years was now filled with laughter, music, conversation. Evelyne watched Garrick move through the crowd, talking easily with neighbors, smiling genuinely, touching her hand or shoulder when he passed like he needed the contact to anchor himself. Later, after most guests had left and only close friends remained, Samuel Collins pulled her aside. "Mrs. Thornvale, Evelyne, I wanted to thank you for what you did during the crisis, the supplies, the organization, the leadership. You saved families, including mine. I just did what needed doing. No, you did what the rest of us were too proud or scared to do. You stepped up when it mattered." He smiled. "The Valley's lucky to have you. Garrick's lucky to have you. I think we're lucky to have each other. Took us long enough to figure that out." When the last guest finally left, Evelyne found herself standing in the front hall with Garrick and Ryland. The house was messy from the celebration, dishes to clean, furniture to rearrange, the detritus of life being lived. "Well," Ryland said, grinning at both of them, "I'd say my work here is done. You two actually look like a married couple now." "Your work?" Garrick raised an eyebrow. "What work exactly did you do besides show up and force conversations I was avoiding?" "Exactly. Someone had to force those conversations. You two would have kept circling each other forever if I hadn't pushed." He grabbed his coat. "I'm heading into town for a few days. Give you lovebirds some privacy. Try not to kill each other while I'm gone." After he left, the house fell into comfortable quiet. Evelyne and Garrick worked side by side cleaning up, not because it couldn't wait until morning, but because it felt good to do something simple and domestic together. "Tired?" Garrick asked as they finished the last of it. "Exhausted. You?" "Same." He pulled her close. "It was a good day, though." "Yeah, it was." They climbed the stairs to their room fully and completely now, and Evelyne felt the weight of the day settling into her bones. She changed into her nightgown while Garrick banked the fire, and when they finally climbed into bed, he pulled her against him with the kind of casual intimacy that still felt new but increasingly right. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me another chance, for the vows today, for choosing us even when it would have been justified to choose differently. Thank you for finally becoming someone worth choosing." He laughed softly. "That's fair." They lay in the darkness, and Evelyne thought about how far they'd traveled from that first terrible conversation during the storm. How they'd gone from strangers sharing a name to people actually building a life together. It wasn't perfect. They still argued, still had days where old hurts surfaced, still struggled with communication and trust, and all the complicated work of undoing 8 years of damage. But they were trying. And trying, she'd learned, was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. Spring arrived in earnest over the next few weeks. Snow melted into rushing streams. The first green shoots appeared in the fields. The valley came alive with the kind of renewal that only happened after surviving a brutal winter. The Thornvale Ranch thrived under the partnership Evelyne and Garrick had built. She managed the household accounts and social relationships. He handled the physical operations and livestock, and together they made decisions that benefited both the ranch and the valley. The respect Evelyne had earned during the crisis held, when she spoke at community meetings, people listened. When she had ideas, they were considered seriously. But the real measure of change wasn't public. It was private. It was Garrick asking about her day every evening. It was working side by side in the library or the accounts office. It was learning each other's habits and preferences and adjusting without resentment. It was small kindnesses that added up to something larger than either of them had expected. One evening in late April, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The air was warm enough finally that being outside didn't require heavy coats. Spring birds called from the trees. Everything felt alive in a way it hadn't during the long winter. "I've been thinking," Evelyne said, "about what you said, about me not being in love with you yet." Garrick tensed slightly. "You don't have to—" "Let me finish." She took his hand. "I've been thinking about it, and I realized something. I don't know if I'm in love with you or not because I don't know what that's supposed to feel like. I married you at 19 with no experience, spent 8 years in a marriage that was just survival, and now we're building something I don't have a reference for." "Where are you going with this?" I don't know if what I feel is love or partnership or just relief that we're not strangers anymore. But whatever it is, it's growing. Every day, it's growing. And maybe that's enough for now. Maybe I don't need to name it or define it or measure it against some standard I've never experienced. Maybe I just need to let it be whatever it becomes." Garrick was quiet for a long moment. Then he brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. That's more than enough. That's everything. They sat in the fading light, and Evelyne thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the woman who'd felt invisible in her own marriage, about the man who'd been too afraid to live, about two people choosing each other despite every reason not to. The frontier had taught them both that survival required hardness, that vulnerability was dangerous, that protecting yourself mattered more than connecting with others. But they'd learned something else too, that surviving alone wasn't the same as living, that the hardest thing and the bravest thing were often the same, that love, messy, imperfect, terrifying love, was worth the risk of breaking. They didn't have a perfect marriage. They probably never would. But they had a real one, built on honesty and effort and the daily choice to show up for each other. And in a place as harsh as Black Hollow Ridge, that felt like its own kind of miracle. As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared, Garrick turned to her with a question in his eyes. What are you thinking about? About how far we've come, about how we almost didn't make it here, about how grateful I am that you finally stopped being afraid long enough to try. I'm still afraid sometimes, probably always will be. That's all right. Fear isn't the problem. Letting it control you is. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that still surprised her sometimes. When did you get so wise? Around the time I stopped waiting for you to save me and started saving myself. They went inside as darkness settled over the valley, the house warm and welcoming in ways it hadn't been for 8 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, ranches always did. There would be arguments and setbacks and days when the weight of their history felt too heavy to carry. But there would also be partnership and conversation and the slow, steady building of something that might actually last. Evelyne Thornvale had spent 8 years disappearing inside a marriage that was only a marriage in name. She'd survived by becoming smaller, quieter, less demanding. She'd learned to expect nothing because expecting things only led to disappointment. But she'd also learned that survival wasn't living, that becoming smaller didn't protect you, it just made you invisible, that the only way forward was to risk being seen, being vulnerable, being fully present even when it was terrifying. And Garrick, proud, stubborn, emotionally frozen Garrick, had learned that control was an illusion, that pushing people away to avoid losing them meant you lost them anyway, that the frontier might be harsh and unforgiving, but the harshest prison was the one you built for yourself out of fear. Together they'd learned that love wasn't something you fell into or stumbled across. It was something you chose, deliberately and repeatedly, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. It was showing up for difficult conversations. It was compromising without losing yourself. It was being honest about fear and trying anyway. The Black Hollow Ridge Valley would remember the winter of 1884 as the year the raiders came and were driven back by coordinated defense. The year the supply crisis threatened starvation but was averted by community cooperation. The year Garrick and Evelyne Thornvale renewed their vows in a ceremony that seemed strange to some and inspiring to others. But for Evelyne and Garrick, it would always be the year they stopped being strangers. The year fear stopped making all their decisions. The year they learned that the frontier's greatest danger wasn't cold or raiders or starvation. It was the isolation that came from refusing to let anyone close enough to matter. They'd survived the winter, but more importantly, they'd learned to live.